Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching an overview of Active Directory certificate services. In this lesson, we're going to start off by learning all about certificates. Okay, we're going to learn exactly what certificates are, because certificates is really what Active Directory certificate services is all about. Then we'll talk about some of the main components that make up Active Directory certificate services. One of those main components is something called a certification authority, so we will talk about those. I'll talk to you then about the concept of using a CA hierarchy. And then finally, we'll wrap things up by going into the operating system and installing Active Directory certificate services. So first of all, what is a certificate? Well, the easiest way to explain what a certificate is it is a form of digital identification. Or we could say it's a digital identification card, so to speak. And the reason I say it's like a digital identification card is because the analogy I like to use, and something I really want you to think of when thinking of what is a certificate, is it's similar to either a driver's license. That's one good example. Or some people like to think of it as like a passport. Okay, these are both forms of identification that people use. Well, a certificate is very similar to a driver's license or a passport. Now, how is it similar? Well, first of all, a certificate contains information about the owner, or we could say the carrier of that identification, the user of that identification. And just like a driver's license or a passport, if you were to present either of those forms of identification, what is somebody going to see when they look at that? They're going to see information about you, the owner or the carrier. But not only do we need information about you, but we also need information about the issuer of the certificate, or again, the issuer of a passport or a driver's license. So as for instance, if somebody shows you their driver's license or their passport, you want to know that it's real, right? You want to make sure that they didn't just make it up in their own basement, right? You don't want it to be a fake ID. You want to know that it's real. And part of the way you know it's real is because it'll have information and very often a signature or some form of seal or stamp from a valid issuer. Well, we have the same thing with a certificate. A certificate will have information about the issuer. And actually, I'll tell you what, I'm going to take this a step further. And I don't want to get too deep into this because it would take us into a whole different lesson. But not only does it have information about the owner and information about the issuer, but it is signed by the owner and signed by the issuer. Okay, now it's not physically signed. So in a network, if you as a user were to go get a certificate, you wouldn't have to pull out a special kind of pen or something and go onto a tablet and sign for it. It has what's called a digital signature. Now, I will tell you, if you want to learn about digital signatures, you want to go research something called PKI, Public Key Infrastructure, which uses public key encryption, which is a form of asymmetric encryption where key pairs are used. You have public keys, private keys, and as part of this whole process, there's this thing called a digital signature. So I will take it that one step further. I can't go into the whole PKI lesson, but I will tell you that it does contain a signature of both the owner and the issuer. Now, another thing I want you to know about certificates, and it's also true for your driver's license or a passport, it has an expiration date. Once a certificate has been issued, it is only valid for a defined period of time. Once that time has passed, the owner of that certificate would have to go get it renewed or updated. And if they don't get it renewed or updated, well, then at that point, it would be revoked, meaning the identification is no longer valid. And that would be the same thing with a driver's license or a passport. If somebody were to hand one of those to you as a form of identification and it had an expiration date from, let's say last year, you would say, no, I do not accept this. I need to see a current form of identification. Now, again, certificates, along with any other form of ID, can also be revoked if there is any reason whatsoever to believe that the certificate is not valid. If we feel there was some form of fraud used when the certificate was obtained, or if maybe some kind of information was compromised or stolen. Okay, there's a lot of different reasons why we may feel that a certificate is no longer valid, and at that point, it can be revoked. And again, this is the same thing with a passport or a driver's license. They can be suspended or canceled or basically revoked if we feel that it's not valid for some reason. Now, there are a number of components that make up Active Directory certificate services. And here I have the 4 main components for you. The first one is your certification authorities. The certification authority, if we go back to our example, is the issuer of the certificate. Okay, so wherever it is that you go to get your passport or your driver's license, whatever government agency you go to, that is the equivalent of the certification authority when it comes to certificate services. Now, the certification authority needs to be a trusted entity. Now, we're going to talk about CAs in just a few minutes in much more detail. But for right now, what is the certification authority? It's the issuer of a certificate. The next component here is CA web enrollment. And this is a component that, quite frankly, just to keep it really, really simple, is a way of simplifying the interface between users and CAs. Now, with CA web enrollment, it allows a user to use a web browser to do things like either request or possibly renew a certificate, or also do things as for instance, like retrieving something called a CRL, CRL, which stands for Certificate Revocation List. Okay, remember I said that certificates can be revoked. Well, if somebody were to hand you a certificate, and again, they're not physically handing it to you, but if you kind of picture it, it's like somebody presents a certificate as a form of ID. Whoever is looking at this certificate to try to validate the user, they may want to know, it looks like a good certificate. Maybe I should check to see if it's revoked. Well, they would find this out through the Certificate Revocation List. And this is something they can do through CA Web Enrollment. The next component we have here is the online responder. Now, this component decodes revocation status requests for specific certificates, evaluates the status of these certificates, and returns a signed response containing the requested certificate status information. What this basically means is, even though we just finished talking about using CA Web Enrollment for downloading a CRL, the Certificate Revocation List, well, now through the use of the online responder, we have a process that is much faster and efficient than using CRLs. Okay, so this is something that is new to Windows Server 2008, and when used, will save time over having to always download the full Certificate Revocation List, or CRL. Now, the last component I want to talk to you about here is something called the Network Device Enrollment Service. And this is a component that basically allows things like routers, so network devices that don't have an actual operating system, it allows these network devices to obtain certificates. So these are the four main components to Active Directory certificate services. Now let's go back and talk a little bit about certification authorities. There's a few different things that you need to consider when it comes to certification authorities. The first thing is, I mentioned a few moments ago that the CA, or the issuer of a certificate, needs to be a trusted entity. So when determining who the issuer of your certificates is going to be, you need to decide if you want it to be a private CA. Now, this would be a CA contained within your organization. And yes, that means the use of everything that we're talking about here. Or if it needs to be a public CA. Okay, there are public certification authorities out there. One of the most well-known public CAs would be VeriSign. Okay, that's a name that you probably have heard of before. Matter of fact, even if you think you haven't heard of VeriSign, you've probably seen the name. If you've ever gone out to a website and you've clicked to install a piece of software from that website, and then you got a little warning dialog box that comes up on your screen, very often that warning dialog box is pretty much a message that is coming up saying, hey, this software you're about to install has been validated and identified by a third-party certification authority, meaning the website is trying to present to your browser a certificate validating the software, and that certificate has been issued by VeriSign. Now, VeriSign is considered to be, by most anyway, a trusted third-party entity, meaning VeriSign has a reputation behind them, that they do a very thorough job at validating that somebody is who they say they are before they will issue them a certificate. Microsoft, as a for instance, will most often use VeriSign when getting a certificate for the various software add-ons that they will use through their websites out on the internet. Now again, VeriSign may not be perfect. There are times where they've issued certificates and they are not valid. They were obtained fraudulently. Well, in that instance, as soon as they figure that out, what do? They revoke the certificate. As a matter of fact, I can tell you a story, and I'll tell you the super fast version of this story, where basically a couple of guys, some way, somehow, convinced VeriSign that they were Microsoft. So yes, what that meant was users out there would get or would attempt to get some software, and then a message would pop up saying, hey, this software was issued by Microsoft, and this is VeriSign telling you that. Are you okay with this? And users would say, well, yeah. I mean, I know who VeriSign is, and I trust who Microsoft is. That's who I want to download the software from. But it wasn't actually Microsoft. Now, this lasted for a very, very short period of time. I don't remember exactly what it was, hours or days, but it was a very short period of time before VeriSign quickly realized, oops, made a big mistake, revoked that certificate, or those certificates as it would be, and those two guys were no longer able to impersonate themselves as Microsoft. Now, when it comes down to private versus public, here's the deal. Who is it that is going to need to see these certificates? In other words, if it's going to be primarily internal use only, then that is where you can go ahead and save your money, because yes, it costs money to get a certificate from a third-party company like VeriSign. You can save your money and create your own certification authority in-house. But if you are going to have, let's say, customers going to your website and downloading software from you, in that instance, you need to use a public third-party CA. And the reason why is because if you were to use an internal private CA, what would happen is when the users go to download your software, they would get a warning box saying, we don't know who is issuing this software, but there's a certificate attached with it that says that this software was issued by, well, let's say Globalmantics. Okay, we've been using Globalmantics throughout the course. Let's say a customer was going to download some software from Globalmantics' website. Well, they would get a certificate saying, this software says it was created by Globalmantics. And you know who's saying that it was created by Globalmantics? Yeah, Globalmantics. That's the issuer of the certificate. Now, as much as you might say, yeah, okay, fine. Globalmantics, that's who I'm trying to deal with. Do I really want to trust a certificate that says, hey, this is Globalmantics saying, trust me, this was given by Globalmantics? No, you don't want to do that, because what if some hacker out on the internet was to go ahead and impersonate themselves as Globalmantics? And they say, yeah, I'm Globalmantics, trust me, because I'm Globalmantics, and that's what the certificate says. I issued a certificate myself. You see where I'm going with this? No one there to truly validate that they are who they say they are. So if you use that third party, and you have something like VeriSign saying, yeah, it really is Globalmantics who's the creator and issuer of this software, then the customers can trust it. Now, I will tell you that a private CA can be used when customers are involved. This is possible. Or let's say it wasn't a customer, let's say it was some kind of different business partners. And you can still do it in a secure fashion where it can be validated. And in just a few moments when we talk about CA hierarchies, you'll see how you could really have a certificate issued by Globalmantics, signed by Globalmantics, and it still be trusted. But it's an inconvenience because every single customer or every single business partner would have to go through a process of adding what's called the root CA, which we'll talk about in just a moment, to their trusted root CA list. And it's kind of a pain. So the bottom line is private versus public. If it's all going to be used internally, private is fine. If you are going to have anybody outside of the company who needs to be involved with these certificates, then you want to use a public CA. How about standalone versus enterprise? Well, I can give you the short version of standalone versus enterprise, which is real simple. Enterprise CAs need Active Directory. And to be more specific, because we are talking about Active Directory certificate services, enterprise CAs need to integrate with Active Directory domain services. Okay, so you have to have an ADDS infrastructure in place to use enterprise CAs. Now, what are some of the other differences between standalone versus enterprise? Well, when using a standalone CA, users can request certificates only through web pages, whereas with an enterprise CA, you can use something called the Certificate Request Wizard, which does not require you to go through the web interface. And another huge difference when we talk about not having to go through the web interface, right? Besides the Certificate Request Wizard, we also can issue certificates through group policy, and then also something called auto enrollment. Okay, and the auto enrollment component is huge when using enterprise CAs, because that means that users, just by being a member of an Active Directory domain, can be automatically recognized and validated and issued a certificate. Because, see, that's the whole purpose of a CA. Not just to issue certificates, but to go through and validate that an entity is who they say they are before giving them the certificate. So with standalone, you're going to go through the web interface to make a request for a certificate, and then an administrator will manually have to validate the credentials of that user and then go ahead and issue the certificate. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between standalone and enterprise. And Microsoft best practice is that your root, which I know I keep kind of jumping ahead, but it's all going to come together at the end. The root CA should be a standalone offline root, and your subordinate or your issuing CAs be your enterprise CAs. Now, speaking of root and subordinate or issuing, that's the last thing I want to talk to you about here when it comes to CAs. The root CA is the topmost portion of your CA hierarchy. Now, I know we haven't talked about the CA hierarchy yet. We're going to do that next. But the root is basically the top. Okay, it's that first certification authority. And I will tell you, you can work in an environment where that's all you have. You just have the one CA. It is your root CA. And it's also an issuing CA. But if you want to have a hierarchy, you can have a root CA, which is at the top, and then you can have subordinate CAs, which are under the root CA, and they get their certificate from the root. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, who does the root CA get their certificate from? Because, yes, even CAs have certificates. Well, the root CA will have what's called a self-signed certificate. Okay, when you start at the top, there is nobody out there to sign that certificate. So a root CA will have a self-signed certificate, and that is where you really come into the whole trust issue. Now let me go ahead and jump to the next screen here where we get into more details here on using a CA hierarchy so that this whole root versus subordinate might make a little bit more sense. Now I have two different examples here. The one on the left is what's known as a two-tier hierarchy. You have the top tier, which is your root CA, which will have the self-signed certificate, and it will then issue the CA certificate to the subordinate, and in this case, issuing CAs. Now, what do we mean by issuing? Because issuing is not an official term that you'll see when you go through and install your CA. Issuing means that this is a CA that has been put in place for the purpose of handing out certificates to the rest of your users and computers and network devices and everything else out on your network. And you'll notice that the root CA in this case is listed as being offline. And obviously the issuing CAs need to be online. Now, why do we do this? Well, we do this for the same reason that we even use a hierarchy. Because you might be thinking to yourself, well, gosh, all right, fine. So there's a hierarchy. Great, we got this little pyramid going. Who cares? Why do we do it? Well, we do it for security reasons. By having the root CA offline, and what we mean by offline is just what it sounds like. We go ahead and create this box, and we have it online just long enough to issue these certificates to the issuing CAs or the subordinate CAs, and then we take it offline, meaning we shut it down, disconnect it from the network. Means it's not accessible to attackers. And this way, if one of your online issuing CAs were to be compromised, right? If someone were to hack into it, all you have to do is go ahead and boot up your offline root CA, bring it online, and have it revoke the certificate for that online issuing CA that got compromised. And automatically, by default, any certificates that that CA had issued, they will also be revoked. But rather than having to completely start over and restructure your entire public key infrastructure, right, your entire CA environment, all you have to do is just reissue a new certificate to the issuing CA. Now, this will be a whole brand new certificate, so the former compromise doesn't matter. And if that's not good enough, if you have to completely rebuild the box and make it a new box, so be it. But your other issuing CAs would still be fine. And users who got their certificates from the other issuing CAs, they'll be fine. This would not affect them. So this is why we use a hierarchy at all. Now on the right-hand side, we have what's called a 3-tier hierarchy. This is a little bit more secure, but a little bit more complex. At the top, we have our offline root CA. That CA does nothing other than issue one certificate to a subordinate CA. Now that subordinate CA, some people will take it offline as well for an added layer of security, or maybe leave it online. It's up to you, depending on how risky a situation you think you're in when it comes to being hacked into. The subordinate CA now takes on the role pretty much of what the root CA did in the 2-tier hierarchy. Its sole purpose in life is to issue the certificate to another layer of subordinate CAs who will then be the issuing CAs for your network entities, users, computers, network devices, etc. Now, here's the deal. Microsoft best practice. Always use some form of hierarchy. Never use just a single tiered hierarchy. Never use just a single row. You want to always have at least the two. Have that one offline root CA. It is also recommended to use either the 2-tier or the 3-tier, but not necessarily recommended to go any deeper than that, because you can. You could create a 4-tier or a 5-tier or a 6-tier. But now you're probably getting complex to a level that completely outweighs the security benefits. So Microsoft best practice is to use either a 2-tier or a 3-tier hierarchy. All right, so now that we've learned exactly what a certificate is, we talked briefly about the different components with Active Directory Certificate Services, and we've learned about our CAs, why don't we go in and actually install certificate services? Okay, so here we are on our Windows 7 client in our globalmantics.local domain. And one thing that I've done is I have added a remote desktop shortcut to Chicago DC1. The two computers we're going to use for this demonstration is New York Member 1 and Chicago DC1. Let's start off with New York Member 1. What we're going to do is create a 2-tiered CA hierarchy. And what we're going to do is New York Member 1, which is in the Forest root domain, we're going to make that the root CA. Now, I do want to tell you that if this was in a production environment, you wouldn't use an existing member server that's serving all sorts of other purposes as we've done throughout this course. I want New York Member 1 at this point to represent to you a member server that we've created for the sole purpose of creating this offline root CA. Okay, but let's go ahead and connect to that now. And then here on New York Member 1, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Server Manager, because Active Directory Certificate Services is a role, just like all the other Active Directory services. So I'm going to go ahead and select Add Roles. And here at the top, you see Active Directory Certificate Services. Check that box. Now mine flashed kind of quickly. Sometimes you might have to wait for just a moment while it installs extra wizard screens, I believe is what it actually says. So if you're seeing that on your screen, if it's taking a few moments, don't panic. Just go ahead and let it finish that process, and then you'll be right where I am now. Just a check in the box. You'll have the different wizard pages that we're going to need to go through. So we're going to go ahead and click Next. Here is a basic introduction into exactly what Active Directory Certificate Services is. We'll go ahead and click Next. Now we get to select our role services. And you'll notice that we have a number of role services that correspond to the main components that I talked to you about. We not only have the certification authority, which is the only one we're going to deal with right now, but we also have our web enrollment, our online responder, and our network device enrollment services. And then down here we also have certificate enrollment web service and certificate enrollment policy web service. Okay, and if you click on any one of these, you'll get a little description here again of exactly what it does. Okay, so for instance, here's the certificate enrollment web service, and it says this enables users and computers to enroll for and renew certificates even when the computer is not a member of the domain, or if the domain joined computer is temporarily outside of the security boundary of the computer network. Okay, so this has to do with if somebody needs to enroll across the internet. Okay, so it basically is going to go ahead and make this into a web server that will be able to support that. Okay, so just kind of showing you that you can click on these and see what the different options are. But for right now, we're going to stick with certification authority and click Next. And now we need to choose, is this going to be an enterprise or a standalone CA? Now here's the thing. We could make this an enterprise CA, but there's really no reason to. And the reason why is because this is going to eventually become an offline root CA, meaning this CA's whole purpose in life is going to be to issue one certificate, and that would be out to an issuing CA. Or more specifically, it may be to hand out a handful of certificates to a handful of issuing CAs. Okay, for this demonstration, it's going to do just one other CA. Okay, but the idea here is it's not going to be a regularly issuing CA. It's kind of a once and done kind of thing. So we can go ahead and do standalone because we don't need to use Active Directory to support the needs of our root CA. This again is somewhat of a Microsoft recommended practice. Okay, there's no reason to involve Active Directory domain services for the root. So we're going to do standalone, click Next. Now we need to decide, is this going to be our root CA or a subordinate CA? And as I mentioned, we are going to make this the root. Okay, so it says if you are installing the first or the only CA, okay, and this is the first, so it's a root. Next. Now it says here, to generate and issue certificates to clients, a CA must have a private key. Now again, this is kind of getting into a whole nother lesson about private and public keys, which is all about the public key infrastructure. And the private key is what's used to sign the certificate. Okay, so we need to decide if we're going to create a new one or use an existing one. And so what we're going to do is we don't want to use anything that was previously out there. We want to go ahead and just create a new self-signed certificate. So it's going to be a new key. So let's go ahead and click Next. Now here we're getting into the details of the cryptography of this key. Okay, so I don't want you to worry about any of this for this particular lesson. There are a number of different cryptographic service providers, or CSPs, that can be used. Basically, that's the different type of cryptography algorithms. Then here you'll notice you can even do how long the key is. The longer it is, the more secure it is against being hacked. And down here you select a hashing algorithm, which is a one-way, non-reversible encryption that is going to be used for the actual signing with this key. Now again, I don't want you to worry about any of this. Just take the defaults for now. As you can see, there is obviously more to know before you will be a true certificate administrator. Okay, but for right now, I just want you to understand the general idea on how to get this thing installed. Okay, but when you get down to a production environment and you're going to install an actual CA, you would want to pay attention to what type of key you're going to assign. And there would be some research involved as to what was going to be a perfect match for your situation. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Now here you go ahead and enter a common name for this CA. We'll just go ahead and take the default. You'll see here it says Global Mantics New York Mem 12K8 CA. That pretty much falls within our overall naming scheme, right? Gives the name of the company, gives the name of the computer, and then it says that it's a CA. So that works for me. Let's go ahead and click Next. Here, how long is this certificate valid for? Remember, they all have an expiration. We're not going to worry about expiration for right now. Obviously, we could change this into a certain number of years, months, weeks, or days. We're just take the default because this is just strictly for a demonstration. In a production environment, you would want to select a validity period that made sense to your situation. And what does that really mean? Well, it comes down to how often do you want to have to renew these certificates versus how secure you want to be enforcing the renewal of these certificates. Okay, so there is no one right answer. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Pick a place for the certificate database. We'll just go ahead and take the default. Next. And now we're on our confirmation screen, in which I just want to point out one thing before we install, and that is this little warning right here. The name and domain settings of this computer cannot be changed after CA has been installed. Okay, so while you are a certification authority, when you are a CA, you have to stay with the same computer name, same domain membership. You would have to uninstall Active Directory Certificate Services if you needed to make a change. So I'm going to go ahead and click Install. And then it's going to go through here and it's going to install Active Directory Certificate Services, just as you can see here. And it'll take just a few moments. And then when we're done, what we're going to do is we're going to jump over to Chicago DC1, and we're going to make that a subordinate issuing CA. And so if you want to kind of think of it as here in the corporate office, we're going to create that root CA. And then in each individual office, we can create an issuing CA for the entities in that office. Okay, so we're only going to do Chicago, but just to kind of give you somewhat of a real world scenario, it might be that in corporate headquarters we have this root, and then in corporate headquarters we probably would have another issuing CA that we would create. And then in each of the other three offices, Chicago, Tokyo, and Dallas, we would create an issuing CA. So as you can see here, installation has succeeded. I'm going to click Close. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and minimize this. And let's go ahead and make a connection to Chicago DC1. Now, I wanted this specifically to pop up, and the reason why is because I want you to notice that we are going to log on as the Global Mantics Administrator. Even though Chicago is part of North America.globalmantics.local, it's always a good idea if you're going to do an enterprise CA, which is what this is going to be, that you be an enterprise administrator for the forest. Okay, so that's why I'm doing the Global Mantics Administrator. So I'll go ahead and enter in that password, and we'll make our connection to Chicago. And then on Chicago, we'll go into the Server Manager. And then we're going to add a role, just like we did on New York Mem 1. And then we're going to check the box for Active Directory Certificate Services. Now, another thing I want to point out is you'll notice that this is our domain controller. There's no rule that says you can't be a domain controller. It's more typical that you would be a member server, though. A computer that would be set up and designed specifically for certificate services. But it is allowed on a domain controller, and that's what we already have from our previous lessons, so we're going to use that. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Here's our introduction. Click Next. Certification Authority, that's what we want to be. Click Next. This time we're going to be an Enterprise CA. Why do we want to use Enterprise? Well, because this is going to be the actual issuing CA. And so we may want to utilize Active Directory domain services to assist us in making certificate deployment more efficient. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. This time we are a subordinate CA. And we're going to go ahead and click Next. Now we're going to go ahead and once again just create a new private key for this issuing CA. Okay, so this is a key that this CA is going to have to be able to go ahead and sign to all the certificates it's going to issue. Click Next. We'll just go ahead and take the defaults here again. We're not going to worry about this. As far as the name, we could change this from North America. Let's go ahead and change this to Globomantics. And then we'll go ahead and click Next. And here, what we're going to do, just so you can see this, is I'm going to actually save the certificate requests and manually send it later to a parent CA. Okay, this is how we get the certificate from the parent, or from the root, really is what we should say here. And what I want to do is kind of truly emulate the fact that we're over this WAN connection. Okay, we're in another office. So we're going to go ahead and just save this request. I'm going to show you how to then use this saved request to go ahead and get the certificate in just a moment. So if we take a look here, you'll see here that the default is on the C drive. We have this Chicago DC1 2k8.na.globomantics.local _globomantics Chicago DC1 2k8ca.request file. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and leave it that way at the root of the C drive. I'm going to go ahead and click Next. We're just going to go ahead and take the default locations for the database itself and click Next. Again, we get that same warning that we can't make changes to the name or domain settings after this is done. And I'm going to go ahead and click Install. Now, the one extra thing that we're going to have to do here is, see, with the root, we just went ahead and made a self-signed certificate, okay, because, well, there is no parent to get it from. Whereas here, you can see installation has succeeded, but with warnings. Active Directory Certificate Services installation is incomplete. To complete the installation, use the request file, blah, 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 that we just created. That's a mouthful. I already read it to you once. To obtain a certificate from the parent CA, then use the Certification Authority snap-in. So this is a utility that you'll see that we have to install the certificate. To complete this procedure, right-click the node with the name of the CA and then click to install the CA certificate. Operation completed successfully. All right, what does that all mean? Well, what that all means is basically I don't have a certificate to issue certificates yet. Okay, I'm a CA, but I don't actually have anything to sign the certificates with. So let's go ahead and click Close. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and go back over to New York Mem 1. And then over here on New York Mem 1, let me go ahead and close out of Server Manager. We don't need that anymore. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click Start, Administrative Tools, and here you will see Certification Authority. This is the snap-in that it was just referring to. Now right up here, here is the actual name of this CA. Now this is the root CA, okay? So we're going to right-click, go to All Tasks, and we're going to go to Submit New Request. What we're doing is we're saying, hey, we're submitting a request for a certificate to be issued. Now, this is extremely manual, what I'm showing you right now. This is the hardest way that you can do this, but I'd rather show you the more difficult ways and then let the easy stuff come later. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in double backslash Chicago DC1 2K8 backslash, and I'm going to put in C $sign. Now, this is a hidden administrative share that points to the C drive, or more specifically, the root of the C drive on Chicago DC1. And if you remember, that's where we put that certificate. So let's go ahead and click Open. And then here you can see the actual request file. If I expand this over a little bit more, a lot more, you can see that's the actual request file, that REQ file. So I'll highlight it and select Open. Now, if I expand this and go to the Pending Requests folder, I've got a pending request. What we want to do is go ahead and right-click All Tasks and Issue. Now, this is the kind of thing that you would only do after you verified exactly what the request was, who it was from, and any other validation that you would need to make sure that it's legit. Okay, but obviously since I'm doing all of this, I know it's all legit. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and select Issue. And then now, there are no more pending requests, but if I go to Issued, you'll see that I now have an issued certificate. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and right-click and select Open. Let's go ahead and open up this certificate. And then when you go to the Details tab, we have the ability to copy this certificate out to a file. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And this is how you export the certificate. Okay, so basically, you want to picture that these two computers are disconnected from one another. Which means not only are we over the WAN link where maybe we don't have a good connection, but maybe we've already taken this root CA offline. Meaning it's not necessarily shut down, but it's not necessarily connected to the network either. Obviously, it has to be connected to the network. That's how we went to the root of the C drive here. But if we didn't, you know what? That file easily could have been burnt to a CD and then shipped to the other office, okay, or emailed. If you have a secure way of emailing it, you could email it to somebody in the other office. Okay, but now this certificate is here and we need to export it out. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. We're going to go ahead and select the Cryptographic Message Syntax Standard PKCS number 7 certificates, which is a P7B file. And check this box that says include all certificates in the certification path if possible. Again, I'm not going to go into all the details of these different formats. Okay, we have these different certificate formats. We're going to go ahead and select this one because this is the best one for what we're trying to accomplish right now. I'm going to go ahead and click Next. For the file name, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put in double backslash Chicago DC1 2K8 backslash C $sign, okay, which means we're going to basically put this certificate, we're going to export it back out to the root of the C drive out on Chicago DC1. And then we're just going to go ahead and call this issuing dash Chicago -CA. The name isn't significant. Okay, it's just a name that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And here's just a summary of what we're about to do. Click Finish. The export was successful. So I'll click OK. Click OK. We can actually close out of this utility and go back. Let me pop out of New York number 1 and come back here to Chicago DC1. We can go ahead and close the server manager here. I just want to show you if I click Start, go to Computer, go to the C drive. I just want to show you, here's that issuing Chicago CA certificate that we just put there. Now again, one thing I just want to point out real quick is that I want you to remember that typically in this scenario, we wouldn't be pointing out to a shared folder on one computer versus the other. If we were going to do that, I would have just told it to send the request automatically and had it all done. This is just to show you what would happen if these were disconnected from one another, which is the more typical scenario. So what we're going to do, let me go ahead and close this. Let's go back to our server manager. In the server manager, we want to go to our roles. And then in here, let me go ahead and expand this over a little bit. We want to go ahead, see here we have Active Directory Certificate Services. Let's expand that. And then here we have the Global Mantix Chicago DC1 2K8 CA. Okay, this is the CA that we want to import the certificate into. So we're going to right-click, All Tasks, and we're going to install CA Certificate. Now obviously we have to locate the certificate. So let's go to our computer, go to the C drive, and there it is, Issuing Chicago CA. So I'll just double-click on that. And basically, that's it. We've now installed it. And now, here we get a message that comes up that says, the root certificate is untrusted. Do you wish to trust the root certificate on this machine and complete the installation? Okay, what's going on here is, remember I said when we deal with internal CAs, we have to establish that we trust that root. So we're going to say yes. We do trust it. We do know what's going on. So I'll click OK. Now these warning messages and things like that, they come up to protect you. If you ever see a message like that come up and you're not in the middle of doing a CA certificate installation or some kind of certificate installation that you know specifically what you're doing, then always say no to that message. All right, so we've now installed the certificate. So now we just need to come over here, right-click on our server, go to All Tasks, and start the service. Aha! Now we actually had a failure here, and truthfully, this is actually my fault. And the reason this is my fault is because we didn't set up an environment to be able to go ahead and check for revocation. The CA is not going to be willing to go through with this process unless it has the ability to verify the certificate revocation list. So what we really need to do to make this all work correctly is we would also want to add the online responder role service as well, and then everything would work fine. But I don't want to worry about that for right now because we're not trying to truly set up this CA infrastructure. I just wanted to show you the basics on how you go through and do this. So I'll click OK. And that is how you would set up your basic, your most basic of basic CA hierarchy. So that takes us to the end of this lesson. And in this lesson, we learned what is a certificate, and to just put it in the most simplistic terms possible, it is a form of identification. Okay, or to be more specific, a form of digital identification. We saw that there were 4 main Active Directory Certificate Services components, including certification authorities, CA web enrollment, online responder, and network device enrollment service. We talked about our certification authorities with regards to when to use private versus when to use public. Talked about enterprise versus standalone. Remember, enterprise means that you're going to go ahead and utilize Active Directory domain services. Standalone, you are not. And we talked about root versus subordinate CAs, which of course then leads us into the talk about using a CA hierarchy. Now it is Microsoft recommended that you use either a 2 or a 3-tier hierarchy. You are perfectly capable of creating a single-tiered hierarchy, meaning basically the lack of a hierarchy, but it's not very secure. And you certainly can go deeper than 3 levels. You could go to 4 levels, 5 levels, whatever you want, but then it's going to get very complex and not give you a whole lot of security benefits. And then the last thing we did was we went into a couple of our servers, installed a root CA, and then installed a subordinate CA. All right, well that's pretty much it. Now again, I just want to remind you, as we saw here, This was a general overview of certificate services. There is a lot more to learn when it comes to truly managing a public key infrastructure. And I can tell you that it's some pretty cool stuff, but it's definitely outside the scope of this course. Okay, so that's all I got for you in this lesson. I'll see you in the next one.